As you're probably already aware, Donald has one approach basically to everything, and it's a zero-sum approach, which means basically that in any scenario, there can be only one winner and everybody else is the loser. Back in the 90s, I took some courses at Teachers College in industrial organizational psych. Do not ask me why, I don't know. But I learned a lot, actually. At the time, basically most approaches to business were zero-sum. Business structures were hierarchical. There were very strict hierarchies, in fact. And at the time, we were learning about less Western approaches to business that were more where power was shared more horizontally. There was a less top-down approach to everything. And, this was information I found interesting, but was never, ever going to use in my life. But I learned something in studying these comparative approaches to business. One is that it seemed like a top-down zero-sum approach to business was not always the best way to go. It essentially blocked out several potential strategies to build alliances and create opportunities. And the other thing I learned is that not only businesses can be zero-sum, families can be too. And mine was. My family was a zero-sum system because of my grandfather, who believed in one thing and one thing only: money. So what does that mean in the context of a family? Well, it means a few things, but here are some of the most relevant. If the only thing that matters is money, if truly, the only thing that gives you a sense of self-worth is your net worth, well, money takes on an outsized importance, not just to the person at the head of the hierarchy, but to everybody else. Now, like most zero-sum systems, my family was very hierarchical, and for probably the first 2 decades of his family life, my grandfather was the only person at the hierarchy, and I think it's safe to say that everybody else, his 5 children and my grandmother, were all equally unimportant and powerless at the bottom, except for my dad, who was the oldest son, namesake, and heir apparent to the Trump real estate empire. This changed over time, but in the meantime, what it meant was that my grandfather was essentially in control of everything. One thing I can say about my grandfather, besides the fact that he was a sociopath and quite a horrible human being, is that he did understand his limitations. For example, he knew that if he wanted to be in control of everything, he had also to control the spheres of his own influence, which were quite small. Yes, he was connected, and he was connected to powerful people, and he had access to all sorts of money and the power structures in New York politics, et cetera, et cetera. But as an individual and a business person, he kept his zones of influence very small because he was afraid, I believe, to venture outside of them. So it was his family system in the house, and it was his business in Brooklyn. He desperately wanted more, but he didn't have certain skills. First of all, his first language was German, and for much of his early life, he had a German accent because both of my great-grandparents came here directly from Germany. My great-grandmother never spoke English particularly well. And my grandfather actually, when his kids were younger, took a Dale Carnegie course in public speaking, and he failed. So he very intentionally kept things small and controllable. And then Donald became Donald. So my grandfather recognized an opportunity when he saw one, and he realized that Donald, as unintelligent and unskilled and, bad at business as he proved himself to be, like bad with money as he proved himself to be, he did serve my grandfather's purposes. My grandfather needed a figurehead. My grandfather needed somebody to go out there and do the selling for him, to make a claim to Manhattan, which was, the holy grail of New York City real estate. Brooklyn and Queens were, as my Aunt Marianne would say, beanbag. I don't know why. I don't know what it means, but I think it's funny. So, what does this have to do with where we are now? Donald grew up understanding that power and resources in my family were limited, and there was a competition for them to the death. As soon as Donald got the green light and realized that he was going to replace his older brother, Freddie, as the heir apparent, he ruthlessly set about making sure that all of the resources would be his. Now, of course, my grandfather was a willing participant in this because without my grandfather, that would never have happened. But again, my grandfather, like other smarter, more successful people than Donald, understood the utility of having Donald be the face of the business. That's where the myth started. So, over the course of decades, my grandfather threw hundreds of millions of dollars at Donald in order to make that myth a reality. Meanwhile, everybody else in the family suffered. My Aunt Marianne and my dad were basically different generations of children. There were 5 of them, and Marianne and my dad were, 8 to 10 years older than Donald and the youngest child, Robert. So they kind of grew up in very different circumstances. And this is a quote from my Aunt Marianne. She and Freddie grew up white poor, whatever that means. So they grew up with this sense of scarcity and the understanding that they had no inherent right to anything. And then over time, my dad got completely boxed out, and Marianne, much later, bought into that whole, my self-worth is utterly tied to what I am worth monetarily. Let's get back to my dad first, though. It was so extreme. And again, this is a family that was extremely wealthy. My grandfather, when he died, was worth about $1 billion. I'm pretty sure all 5 children could have done quite well. But between my grandfather and Donald, believing deeply that every penny they gave away or every penny they lost diminished them and strengthened the other person, well, that just couldn't happen. Now, my dad, of course, having failed spectacularly in my grandfather's eyes, needed to be punished. Now, one way to do that was to humiliate him. But another way to do that was to humiliate him by depriving him of what was essentially his birthright, his position in the company, but also his wealth. My dad died poor, but he also died in a situation that, in the context of the family, was unspeakable, and it was all to enhance Donald's own position. Basically, before he died, while Donald was being handed tens of millions of dollars on a regular basis, my grandfather hired my father to be on a maintenance crew at one of his vast properties in Brooklyn. So that's how Donald, one of the ways I should say, that Donald enhanced his own sense of his superiority. And again, what was drilled into these people, my grandfather's 4 children, because my dad obviously came to believe that he deserved absolutely nothing, was if you are going to be worth anything, you have to hang on to every penny you have. Now, Marianne tried, she tried to be generous, but even when she was charitable, she had to do it in a way that enhanced her own sense of her superiority. And this is the thing about the Trumps, and I know this is not limited to them. I think this is true about many rich people in this country or in the world. They actually believe they're better than we are because they have money, right? So here's the thing. We are still living with that burden. As you are aware, Donald Trump acts as if the U.S. Treasury is his own personal bank account. With this tariff insanity, we see that this is playing out because he feels so aggrieved that other countries might be taking advantage, not just of the United States, but of him, that they somehow must be scamming off of him, must be stealing his money, and therefore what? Making him worthless. Or worthless, as the case may be. So he's overreacting to all of this because he's taking it so personally. And the truth of the matter, of course, is that this is all, it's like triggering all these defense mechanisms. Because on the one hand, deep down, he knows he's worthless. He knows he's worthless. It doesn't matter how much money he has. But because it was so drilled into him, your net worth is your self-worth, he is fixated on making sure he exacts every single cent he can from everybody. But of course, he's the one who's taking advantage of. He's the one screwing people over. He's the one who's playing fast and loose and stealing from us, right? So this leaves us in a very, very dangerous situation because it's never enough for Donald Trump. He always needs more. How does this end? Well, I don't know how it ends with him and with us. We're finding out that it's not going well, but this is how it ended with my grandfather. He started showing symptoms of Alzheimer's when he was in his late 70s, I believe, when he was about Donald's age, actually. Of course, he lived to be almost 93, and in the early to mid-90s, he began to decline rapidly. He stopped recognizing most of the people in his life. At the end, the only people he remembered were my grandmother and Donald. And he eventually forgot my grandmother, whom he'd been married to for over 60 years as well. And, you know, for various reasons, he stayed home. He was never sent away. They had a bodyguard because he would sometimes leave the house in the middle of the night without, you know, pants on. And this was an extraordinarily stressful situation for my grandmother, who was left to deal with it almost entirely by herself, despite the family's vast wealth. And my grandfather had two very different experiences. On the one hand, you know, every morning they dressed him up in his three-piece suit. His chauffeur drove him to his office in Brooklyn. He sat behind his desk. He signed blank pieces of paper. He felt like he was on top of the world. He was running his empire. But then, sometimes at home, he would forget. He would forget where his checkbook was. He would forget just how incredibly wealthy he was. He would fly into rages and accuse my grandmother of stealing his checkbook and stealing his money. And he blamed her because after everything he'd done, here he was, Fred Trump, master of the universe, and he believed himself to be dirt poor. He had lost all sense of his worth at the end. That is what Donald Trump is struggling against. That knowledge. And here's the thing, again, because he conflates his net worth with his self-worth, he's still going after the money in the hopes that that will somehow fend off this other just abject terror he has, which is, of course, an inalterable truth. Donald Trump has never been worth anything. Please take a second and like and share this video. Be awesome if you could subscribe to the channel. If you're listening to us in podcast form, please follow us and give the show a 5-star rating because it really does help other people find our content. Thanks.